Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today and talk to you about the work that we're doing at the Ahimsa Center. For those of you who are not familiar with the word Ahimsa, it means nonviolence. And before I begin, I'm curious, do any of you have experience in K-12 education? Right? Have you ever teachers, have family who are teachers? Okay, so I think one of the interesting questions when we talk about nonviolence is how do you teach this to kids? How do you bring it into the classroom? And so the talk I'm going to give you today is about the ways in which teachers can be trained to cultivate peace and nonviolence in their communities all over the country. Before I begin, though, I want to sort of talk about the picture that we're facing in American schools today. And I don't need to probably talk too much about this, as we know from the news. It happens every day all over. So one of the things that I did in preparation for this project, for this talk, is to look at some of the studies at violence in schools today. And when I was very surprised to discover that 24% of high school deaths today of students who are in high school are either homicide or suicides. That's the second, homicide is the second cause of death amongst high school students. 40,000 students and 8,000 teachers are physically attacked in American schools every month. 1 in 4 students reported being victim of bullying, a physical attack, verbal assault, or being a witness to gang violence. And I think it's important to include that because it's not just when it's physical violence, it's also being a witness to violence that can be very hurtful. 10% of American 8th graders reported bringing a gun or a knife, some kind of weapon to school. What's also really shocking to me is that it's not just that students are experiencing violence outside of the school, it's that actually schools are becoming more violent than their lives away from school. So one study I was looking at talked about the fact that students who are aged 12 to 18 were victims of 1.5 million non-fatal crimes at school, while they were only victims to that only 1.1 million times outside of school. So it's actually that schools are becoming more violent places. Of course, there are consequences to this. I'm going to actually turn this way so I can sort of face you guys a little bit better. There are emotional consequences. Students report feeling stressed, avoiding certain classes, feeling alienated, feeling confused, angry and depressed, having lower self-esteem. And the problem with it, of course, is that when kids feel that way at school, when they grow up, they take these feelings with them. And it's that place where those feelings are really cultivated. I was a teacher for 10 years. I started teaching in Rochester, New York as a student teacher. I was a high school teacher in the Hacienda La Puente Unified School District in Hacienda Heights, just not far away from here. And one of the things that really surprised me also was the way that we deal with violence in schools, right? So some of you are probably familiar with the fact that we have what are called peace officers, which I think is an ironic name, which are actually security guards often with batons, or in some places they actually have guns as well. Metal detectors, so that students can be screened on the way in. Video cameras and surveillance. There are some schools now that have video cameras inside every classroom, so classrooms can be surveilled outside of that. Random bag checks. A lot of times now when there are gun threats on campus, a squad will arrive and every single student will be searched, every single bag will be searched. This happened just recently at a school that I taught at. And of course this question of zero tolerance policies, which is to say we won't tolerate any harassment, we won't tolerate any violence. But of course what that means is that we're not actually dealing with how to deal with violence, we're just trying to find ways to stop it, and sort of by saying there will be no violence here, that it's somehow going to create no violence. I was a third-year teacher when the September 11th attacks happened, and this is for me really the origin of where I began to think about violence and the way that I was experiencing it in the classroom. I was surprised in the months and years that followed how much my students were absorbing the anger that was, I think, really characterizing American discourse at the time. I'm sure you all remember what that was like. And so students were coming to me every year with really racist beliefs, beliefs that war was the only answer, beliefs that the Middle East was an evil place, that Islam was an evil religion. And as a teacher, I felt really powerless. Like, how do I deal with this? How do I address this? Is this my job to actually address this? And I was always sort of minding the internet and seeing all kinds of stories of teachers being reprimanded for offering anti-war beliefs, for showing what are called liberal films, like An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore. That film was banned in my district, actually, after a teacher showed it, and it was deemed too liberal, right? So I was seeing all kinds of cases of teachers being sort of censored at this time when it was expected that they would promote the foreign policy that was going on at the time. So it wasn't just this idea of militarism, but I also was really thinking a lot about racism, homophobia, xenophobia, and poverty as sort of structural things that I was, as a teacher, experiencing every day. And so like I said, every year after the initial attacks, I was really sort of feeling, what am I supposed to do? Where's my agency as a teacher? What can I actually do or say to help kids understand that there are different ways of thinking about responding to violence. So it was in that context that I saw a flyer in my mailbox on campus. This was in 2005 when we actually still used paper flyers for things. And I was shocked by an announcement for a K-12 institute at the Ahimsa Center at Cal Poly Pomona. And you can see some of the language here. But for me, what was so important was to think about the ways that teachers actually are critical to building peace. And so when I saw this flyer in my mailbox, I thought, this is something I have to apply to. This is something that I need to do. So the Ahimsa Center is at Cal Poly Pomona, and if you're interested in knowing more, it's, the director of the center is here with us today. Dr. Sethi is in the audience, and so I'm hoping that you'll be in touch. And also, I'm sure you can get in touch with her over email if you have more questions. But really, there are sort of three prongs to the center's mission. There is higher education initiatives, K-12 initiatives, and community initiatives. My goal today is to talk to you about the ways that the center is really trying to connect nonviolence to the K-12 community. So I assisted an institute in 2005, as I mentioned. It was a 2-week program on nonviolence and social change. And the 30-odd teachers of us who were there were really there to think about the ways that we could bring that concept, nonviolence, into our classrooms. We had math teachers, primary school teachers, middle school teachers, English teachers like myself. And it was great to really get a sense of the ways that different teachers in different areas are able to bring this concept to their students' lives. In that time since, I've now been working at the center as a teacher mentor. So I go back every other summer and work with the teachers that come to help them develop curriculum and really get a grasp on how can I create curriculum that's meaningful for my students and meaningful for me, but also connected to the kinds of things that have to happen in my curriculum. So we've had 4 institutes since then. And the first one was focused on Gandhi. The one after that was on Gandhi and King. The third one after that was Gandhi and Chavez. And the goal of those institutes was to help teachers understand the journey of nonviolence that each of these people took, right? None of these people started as nonviolent exemplars from birth, right? It's a journey that you have to go on before you arrive at that kind of possibility. So what we're doing this summer is now we're working on a thematic institute that's going to focus on Gandhi, sustainability, and happiness. And so we're currently accepting applications. If you know any teachers, there's still time to apply, so I hope that you'll pass that on to them. And so I'm really excited to see the ways that we can now move towards those kind of themes with our teachers. As a PhD student, I feel like I'm obliged to give a nod to theory. I won't spend too much time on this. I should mention I'm a PhD student at NYU in international education, and my research is on the ways that teachers mediate social change, get involved in activism, and so I see this as something that's very connected to that, the way that teachers really get involved in their communities. And so peace education, I think, is a really great field, but what I find is that often it's really trapped in theory, and there's not a lot of real studies that look at, well, what are the actual effects of these programs? What happens when teachers get trained? What happens when people in the community get trained? What are the outcomes? And so also one thing I want to do today is talk about the ways that peace education really needs to think about nonviolence more as a part of or a principle to organize around. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but one of the things I do think is important is that any peace education initiative needs to remember that the people who are going to do the work are teachers. And so you have to train teachers to believe in this and to transform themselves before they can effectively teach students these ideas, right? And so one of the studies I looked at talked about this, that teachers who carry out peace in education have to cherish its values, hold comparable attitudes, and exhibit similar behavioral tendencies. So you can't talk the talk, right, unless you walk the walk also. I'll skip this slide for now. So again, why are teachers important? Well, I think there's 3 kind of critical things to think about and why they are critical agents in this process. So one is that teachers work in multiple spheres. They're not just in the classroom. They're also working with families. They're also working with teacher associations. They might also run clubs on campus. They might be coaches, right? So they have a lot of spheres of influence. And I think that that's really important, thinking about how teachers can create change. Second, when teachers are trained to be teachers, they actually are really, part of what's embedded in a lot of teacher education programs these days are helping teachers think about themselves not just as teachers, but also as human beings, but also about the politics that are involved in teaching. So a lot of teacher education programs focus on multiculturalism, social justice, so they're really taught to think about the implications of what they're doing in the classroom. And last, they're role models, obviously, right? They're seen as models and as examples for their students, and I think that that's one of the reasons why they are critical if we want to really cultivate peace in our communities. So who are our teachers? Every year we every institute, we accept applications. We select 40. It's a national institute. It's residential. So this is a very unusual kind of professional development program. The teachers come to us. They spend 2 weeks at Cal Poly Pomona in sort of not an ashram setting, I would say, but the teachers like to consider it that. They call it Gandhi camp a lot of times. And they really get to sort of live with each other, talk to each other. And I think what's great is that because they're from all over the country, they really begin to realize that what they feel and what they experience in their local communities, they're not alone in that, right? That people from Oregon and Florida and New York have a lot to share, or a lot in common. And so I think this is a really exciting sort of model for professional development for teachers, because it's really helping them embody and really live this as opposed to just learning about it. So one thing that we did last summer and in the fall was we sent out a survey to the about 150 teachers that we've trained at these institutes, and really began to sort of get a sense of, well, what are the implications of this? What are the ways that this has influenced your life? And at the institute, the teachers are spending basically 2 weeks in a graduate level kind of setting where they do lectures, workshops, they work with scholars on Gandhi and King and Chavez. And for a lot of them, it's very intensive because they begin to realize that peace is not easy. It's not easy to embody this. It's not easy to learn or to transform oneself. And so one teacher, after watching A Long Night's Journey into Day, which is, if you're familiar, it's a documentary on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which is really about the way that people have to learn to forgive on a national level, right? Which is, I mean, you can learn about forgiveness, but then to see it in this sort of way, you realize, wow, this is a lot harder than I realized. This is really tough work. And this one teacher, she said, I was angry at the scope of the entire idea of ahimsa, nonviolence, and I openly cried during the discussion because I realized all of the motivating ideas I was learning were so much more than lessons of being kind, but a whole transformation that meant life had to change as we know it. And I was not sure I was able to make that big of a change in myself. The other teachers were overwhelmed by the power as well, and I remember a lot of hugging after an intense discussion, and it was like we knew the idea was larger than we had first thought. So I think that really exemplifies for me the kinds of transformation that teachers begin to go through, because they realize it has to begin within, right? This is why this talk is called Being the Change, because they realize if they're going to really do this for their kids, they have to live it. They have to begin with their own, bringing nonviolence into their own lives. Just quickly, one of the things we also asked them was like, what kind of things do you feel, or what kind of things do you think about once you leave? And so many teachers talked about, I think one thing that shocks me every time I meet these teachers is how much trauma they bring with them. Teachers are seeing so much violence in their schools today. I can't tell you how emotional some of these institute sessions are, because their teachers are working through the trauma they bring with them. I mean, I wouldn't go as far to say that it's PTSD, but when you're working 8 hours a day with students in that kind of institutionalized setting, it can be very traumatic when you see the kinds of violence that kids experience and the kinds of violence that they exist around. And so when they leave, I think teachers feel a real sense of calm, a real sense of empowerment, a real sense of agency. Of course, they also feel challenged by the reality of going back to their communities, and they sometimes have a hard time expressing this change to other people. But what we're finding is that teachers are really, over time, finding ways to bring this not only to their classrooms, but to their colleagues, to their communities, and to their families as well. So again, in looking at some of the theoretical literature around peace education, one thing I've been really interested in is the idea of transformative optimism, which I think is really critical to think about when we think about agency. What does that mean? And so this, his name is Cesar Augusto Rosado. He's a theorist who talks about the ways that people can have a transformative optimism, a belief that they're able, that they're necessary and viable participants in the process of social change. That's critical, I think, for any society, right? To believe that you actually have the power to do something. And I think that our teachers are expressing this. And I didn't know this concept even really existed. I guess it's kind of intuitive, but I think that our teachers are telling us that they're experiencing this. One example, so one teacher here from California wrote this in her survey to us. Being in the Institute became a quiet awakening in me. Unbeknownst to me, the Institute not only transformed my perceptions as a teacher, but also as a mother, wife, daughter, citizen, and human. In my world, I discovered that there was a power to become an agent of change. Through the Institute, I began to take the first step, transforming myself. So I think it's really amazing that teachers are telling us this sort of authentically on their own, and that this is not something we're directing them to sort of give back to us. This is something that teachers are feeling. And when I started doing the literature review, sort of thinking about peace education, I was shocked about how much there was a connection between these concepts and the real experiences our teachers are having. So now let's talk about the lessons, which to me is the best part. So here are some of the different ways that teachers from the K-12 sector are bringing it to their students' lives. So we have teachers who are writing lessons on restorative justice, the art of nonviolence, bullying, writing The Power of One, which is a math lesson on number one and the way that the number one implies integrity, power, wholeness. Gandhi's view of women, the story of Muhammad Ali's resistance to the Vietnam War, breaking unjust laws, and nonviolence as a way of life in an art class. So I'll give you an example of one first grade teacher and how she brought this to her students' lives. She made this PowerPoint for our institute, and I'll show you in a minute another example. But the teachers, while they're there, along with writing curriculum, also create sort of multimedia presentations that will sort of aid them in helping kids of the 21st century kind of get these concepts, kind of get them hooked in, right? So this is a HIMSS first grade. She has these really great pictures and images. So this is the way the slide works. Like, what is a HIMSS, right? And a lot of first graders probably won't know what that is, I'm guessing. A HIMSS is nonviolence. Well, violence is when you hurt someone's body, when you say mean things to hurt someone's feelings, when you do things that make someone feel like they are not as good as everyone else. Right? So these are simple things, right? Things that a first grader can understand, right? I mean, this is sort of speaking a first grader's language. So the next slide. A HIMSS is nonviolence. It is forgiveness and solving problems. Sorry, that came out a little bit wrong, a little bit off here. But what if someone hits me? I'm not supposed to fight back? Question, right? So these kids might be asking this, right? If they're sitting in front of the teacher, like, wait, am I supposed to not fight back when someone's violent towards me? Next slide. You are supposed to fight back. Sorry. But in a very different way. You fight with kindness, your voice, and with your love, right? This is very simple, but I find that this is one of the ways that teachers are really making this accessible to their kids. They use big fonts, kind of snappy effects, right? And the kids, I think, respond to this because it's speaking to them in a way that, for their age level and for their comprehension level, makes sense. Some of the other kind of lessons, we have people who do lessons on Swaraj, the idea of the power of the people, the way that language has become militarized, questions of modern civilization and the way that Gandhi criticized modern civilization. What is Satyagraha, the idea of soul force, and the way that Dr. King and Gandhi both used Satyagraha in their campaigns to create social change. Of course, there's connections to Thoreau, which is a really easy sort of way connecting to American literature and American history, sustainability, MLK on Vietnam. One of my favorite lessons is a math lesson that a teacher did, where he had students understand the idea of slope by graphing the number of days that that people sat in at the lunch counters in Birmingham and the amount of money that was lost because of the sit-ins, right? So there's a really powerful way of showing the connection between activism and change, but making it a mathematical concept, right? So I thought this was a really innovative lesson. I want to show you a quick snippet of a video. So like I said, our teachers also create digital stories for their students, and this teacher, who's a kindergarten teacher in Oregon, had a lesson on food, and her goal was to help students understand the ways that food is connected to violence through its production and through its distribution, and this was at an institute on Chavez. So I'm going to show you the clip, and I really want to point out the ways that she's making it relevant for her students, making it accessible for her students, and really connecting it to their communities.
All beings need food to live. Virginia Woolf, a famous poet, said, "One cannot think well, love well, sleep well, if one has not dined well." To me, this means that food is not only necessary to live, but also necessary to live a full life. At Sunnyside Environmental School, nature is our teacher. Every year, we harvest vegetables, create delicious snacks, and nourish our bodies. Some of the food we eat comes from gardens and farms, and some we buy in packages at the grocery store. A well-balanced person usually eats some of both. Some food is made in factories, and some we make ourselves. What's your favorite part of working in the gardens? Harvesting, digging the dirt, eating what you helped create? Think about a tomato. Do you like to eat it raw? How about a spaghetti sauce? Chips and salsa? Ketchup? All of these different foods were made with tomatoes. Did you eat one at lunch today? Talking about lunch, that makes me think of all the extra food we help create that goes to waste, especially during the summer when we are all away from school. Is there a way to work together with the Sunnyside community? Who is here over the summer? Who's hungry? Who wants to garden?
Great, so I think that was a really great video, right? You get the sense of the way it's connected to the community, to kindergartners. I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna quickly just jump through a couple of other lesson plans. So one teacher in San Diego has an art history lesson where he has students create footwear using recycled, found, or sustainable items, and they read Gandhi's thoughts on Swadeshi, self-sufficiency. And I think it's really great because he's helping students understand a concept through doing an actual project. One teacher at a school in Pasadena it's a Spanish class, but she had students think about the idea of stuff. And she would have her kids like look in their bags and like, what do you have in your bag? What's all the stuff you have? Like, where did that come from? Where's it gonna go, right? What are the origins of it, and where is it gonna end up later when you're done using it? So think about materialism and the way that we acquire stuff. I'll quickly mention a lesson that I created for a group of students. I wanted to have students really understand the idea of Satyagraha, Soul Force, and Ahimsa. And so I had students compare Gandhi and King. And so it was really a very simple lesson. I had them read A Pilgrimage to Nonviolence by King and Gandhi's text, Ahimsa, or The Way of Nonviolence. And it's very simple. It's something that kids at the high school level can understand. So what happened is that a few months after this lesson, there was a series of fights on campus. And the seniors who were expecting to have a dance that week, the dance got canceled because the principal was upset by all the fights that were happening on campus. So students were really upset. They said, what are we gonna do? Like, we don't support this violence. It's all the freshmen who are doing this. How are we gonna fix this? And so the students decided to organize a nonviolent protest using some of the concepts that they had learned about in this lesson. So they had this party over the weekend where they all went to someone's house and made banners and made posters. And I think it was like they were kind of like love-in, right? Their kind of idea of like a way of bringing peace to their own lives. And then they, the following Monday on campus, walked out during the lunch hour, and like there's a quad area and like a staging area. And they went out there and they had all these posters, they posted them all over campus, they wore their t-shirts, and had this kind of like a Ahimsa march, right? So I don't know how great these images are, how well you can see these, but this one student on the bottom right has a sign that says Ahimsa, right? Which to me was just like shocking to see a student really like own that concept with such sort of pride. I think to me what it really taught me is that when you provide students just a little bit of knowledge about nonviolence, they can actually really take it and do something with it that's their own, that's original, you know? So I think that's a really powerful way to end. And the last thing I want to talk about is just this one last concept that a teacher wrote in her survey to us. So she writes, before the Institute, I used heavy-handed classroom management that often escalated problems rather than prevented it in the first place. I teach my younger kids now about perspective taking early in the year. So when we are having problems, I approach it from a, what's your sense of what's going on, rather than a, you're being bad perspective. The students and I strive for mutual understanding rather than the idea that I'm in charge and it's my way or the highway. And she says, I also approach my profession with more joy. After all, who's the solution? I am. Right? So I think that really encapsulates what I've been trying to get at today. I thank you for your attention, and thanks again.